If you're under 40, you've probably never heard of the stat I'm about to talk about today. This is not a stat that's in the middle of an analytic versus traditional debate. It's probably a stat that both parties would hate if it was still around. But before I tell you about the stat and the history, I think we need to talk about baseball stats in general. It's one thing that I think gets lost in the discussion in the great divide of the age of statistics. As an analytical stat head myself, it's easy to think of stats like pitchers' wins, RBIs, and saves as useless, archaic stats. But it's really not that simple. One thing I've come to understand about traditional stats is that they're not all the same age. Traditional stats didn't sit untouched after 1880 until some analytical nerd decided to disrupt everything in 2000. WHIP, for instance, is over 40 years old. Is it an analytical stat or a traditional one? It seems closer to an analytical one, but it's not one that's referenced by the community that often. And what about saves? Analytical minds hate saves because they think they're dumb, which they kind of are, but they're only like 50 years old, which means pitchers like Walter Johnson and Cy Young were long past before the stat was even created. Tell me in the comments what you think of these stats, and let me know why my opinions on WHIP are bad. Despite how I feel about a certain stat, they almost never die. No matter how old or new a stat is, or whether it's considered analytical or traditional, once it enters the mainstream, meaning it excludes stats like Bailey Freeman's GPH or GPP, they're here to stay. Unless you're the rule once listed as Rule 1004A. Invented back in 1980, the stat was supposed to show a hitter's clutch. It also served as a hitter's equivalent to the pitcher's win, and it was called the game-winning RBI. Of course, now pitcher's wins are one of the most divisive stats out there, along with, of course, the RBI. So this combination couldn't have been more flawless. The arguments by today's standards seem pretty clear. It was a flawed stat that didn't actually measure the thing that it aimed to do. Now we have stats like win probability added that do a much better job at telling us clutchness. But these stats weren't widely available back then. Considering the fact that pitchers' wins were widely accepted back then, it seems like the game-winning RBI should have as well. So why have you never heard of the stat? I guess it's time to really explain how the stat worked. Essentially, the stat took whichever RBI that put the winning team ahead for good and marked that as the game-winning RBI. This meant that RBIs in the first inning of games that ended 13-0 was counted the same as a walk-off game winner. But there was an even worse flaw of the stat, and I think we should look at this Tigers-Twins game from last year as an example. The scoring kicked off in the top half of the second when the Tigers scored 2 runs thanks to 2 RBI singles, the first coming on a grounder by Grayson Greiner. This lead would be further expanded when the Tigers scored 8 runs in the top of the fourth, giving them a 10-0 lead going into the bottom half of the inning. In that half of the inning, the Twins scored 6 runs thanks to 2 big flies, but the Tigers still had a 4-run lead. 2 innings later, Detroit added 3 more runs, pushing the lead back up to 7, where it would stay until the bottom half of the 8th when the Twins hit 4 homers and scored 6 runs. The Tigers would answer right back in the top half of the 9th, however, and won the game 17-14 after allowing 2 more runs to cross the plate in the bottom half of the 9th.
Over. The Tigers hold on and beat the Twins in a wild one, 17-14.
It was a weird game, but it's especially weird considering that the Tigers led the whole way through. So, even though the stat has been dead for over 30 years, let's pretend that it still existed. Which RBI would be given the game-winning distinction? The Grayson Greiner RBI that put the team up 1-0? Or the Eric Haas double that scored 3 runs to make it 16-12, pushing Detroit past the 15 runs they needed to eventually win? If you guessed the Eric Haas double, you would be absolutely wrong. The game-winning RBI was the first RBI that put the team up for good. Since the Tigers never relinquished the lead after 1-0, Greiner gets the game-winning RBI. So even if a team won 100-99, as long as the team didn't relinquish the lead past 1-0, the player who knocked in the first run would get the RBI. This is essentially the inverse of how a pitcher's loss works. Just last season, Pablo Lopez threw 1 pitch, hit a batter, and was ejected. He was hit with the loss because that runner came around to score, and the Marlins never came back to even tie the game. Had the game-winning RBI operated more like the pitcher's win, only taking effect if the RBI happened after a certain inning, it probably would still exist. However, it didn't, and players hated it. After just 8 years as a stat, it was killed. Players like Mike Schmidt panned the stat, calling it absolutely ridiculous. The all-time leader in game-winning RBIs, Keith Hernandez, suggested ways to fix it, but conceded that it was kind of broken. And George Brett called it stupid. It's surprising that a stat would be completely killed without alteration, but I think it's one where traditionalist and analytic heads would likely agree. It wasn't worth keeping.